At 2:37 p.m. over the South China Sea, a Chinese Z-10 attack helicopter cut across the sky with orders to deter an American patrol. The mission sounded simple: buzz the U.S. Navy helicopter, make some noise, and remind Washington that Beijing doesn't like company in its backyard. But the pilot was about to find out that intimidation and actual combat readiness are two very different things. What began as a show of force turned into a career-ending blunder, exposing weaknesses China never wanted the U.S. to record. The American aircraft wasn't just any helicopter. This was an MH-60R Romeo, the U.S. Navy's Swiss Army knife in the air. Anti-submarine hunter, electronic snoop, and maritime guardian all in one. Its three-man crew knew exactly what they were doing because they weren't simply flying patrol. They were monitoring a Chinese submarine lurking beneath the waves, one that was running out of air and desperately trying to recharge its batteries. Beijing thought a Z-10 buzzing the Romeo would mask the sub's position. In reality, it handed the U.S. a priceless gift: a front-row seat to Chinese radar, radio, and panic. For the next 72 minutes, the Z-10's presence created a storm of electronic signals and tactical mistakes that Romeo quietly vacuumed up. Every radar ping, every communication burst, and every desperate maneuver, it was all being recorded. While the Chinese pilot believed he was scaring off an American helicopter, instead, the wrong target had been chosen and the consequences echoed far beyond that single flight. The question wasn't whether the Romeo crew would back down, because they wouldn't. The real question was how much classified Chinese data they would capture before the Z-10 finally realized its mistake. The Romeo crew didn't flinch when the Z-10 swept across their nose at just a few hundred meters. They'd seen this before. Chinese intercepts designed to rattle nerves, force an early retreat, and give Beijing a photo op of defending its airspace. Only this time, the crew knew that they weren't even close to Chinese territorial waters. At 50 nautical miles out, they were flying in international airspace, where every Navy crew is trained to hold their ground. For the Z-10 pilot, however, it wasn't about legal boundaries. He had one job: intimidate. Banking hard, he fired off two flares, streaks of fire cutting through the humid sky. It wasn't an attack, it was theater, like a warning shot that wasn't supposed to land. To the Romeo, though, the display was meaningless. The American crew didn't even break formation, because they were forced to focus on the real prize, the submarine below. This Romeo wasn't joyriding. Every little bump on its fuselage, strange pods, sensors, and protrusions was designed for serious work. Its AN/APS-153 radar could detect periscopes slicing through waves, while its dipping sonar could reach deep into the ocean to track submarines in real time. Add in the AN/ALQ-210 electronic support measures, and the helicopter was less a target than a flying vacuum cleaner. Every time the Z-10's radar painted them, every time its comms chirped to headquarters, well, those signals were sucked up, stored, and analyzed. Beijing thought it was forcing America out. In reality, it was giving the U.S. Navy a master class in Chinese electronic signatures. The Z-10, with its angular armor and menacing silhouette, looked dangerous at a glance, but looks don't win fights. Against a modern Navy helicopter designed for electronic warfare, it was like showing up to a chess match with checkers pieces. Every aggressive move the pilot made only dug the hole deeper, adding more noise, more emissions, and more data for the Romeo to capture. And then came the worst moment. The submarine the Z-10 was supposed to protect realized it was still being hunted. That's when intimidation turned into panic. And panic in submarine warfare always leaves a trace. From the outside, the Romeo looked like just another helicopter with odd lumps glued to its body. But to the crew sitting inside, those pods were their real weapons. The AN/ALQ-210 electronic support measure system, sitting quietly on the fuselage, was doing the heavy lifting. Think of it as a digital sponge. It soaked up everything the Z-10 gave away. Radar frequencies, radio chatter, even the faint electromagnetic hum of its engines. Every second the Chinese pilot tried to impress his superiors, the Americans were building a library of his helicopter's secrets. This wasn't random spying. Collecting signatures is the backbone of modern warfare. Every radar has its own fingerprint, a unique frequency pattern that can later be recognized instantly. If war ever broke out, U.S. forces wouldn't have to guess. They'd already know exactly what a Z-10 looked like on their screens. And the best part? The Chinese were handing it over willingly, thinking that they were winning a stare down. Meanwhile, the Romeo crew wasn't just listening. They were working the water beneath them. Their dipping sonar, a device lowered into the ocean like a microphone into an orchestra pit, was still tracking the submarine below. Diesel-electric subs like the Chinese Type 039 can be sneaky, silent when running on batteries, but the laws of physics are unforgiving. Batteries drain, and when they do, the sub has to surface or snorkel to recharge. That makes them loud and predictable. The Romeo knew exactly when to strike with its sensors. Here's where the Z-10 pilot made his biggest mistake. By focusing all his attention on harassing the helicopter, he forgot about the bigger picture. Every radar sweep from his cockpit announced to the world, "Here I am." Every time he keyed his radio to report in, the Romeo sensors logged his communication frequencies. The US didn't just see a helicopter buzzing them, they were mapping an entire system of Chinese tactics step by step. For the submarine, the pressure was mounting. In undersea warfare, noise is death, and panic was about to push them into a mistake far louder than anything the Romeo could transmit. In submarine warfare, silence means survival. Diesel-electric boats, like the Chinese Type 039A, are quiet killers when they're running on their battery power, but once they need to recharge, stealth disappears. To snorkel near the surface is like lifting your head above water while holding your breath. You might survive, but now everyone can see you. This sub had been forced up to breathe, and the Romeo sonar locked onto it instantly. The Z-10 was supposed to buy breathing room, but instead its antics had drawn even more attention. Desperate, the submarine commander ordered an emergency dive. That maneuver, however, created the exact opposite effect. Diving too fast causes cavitation, tiny air bubbles exploding off the hull, which sounds like fireworks underwater. Add to that the popping of metal under sudden pressure changes, and the once stealthy boat was now broadcasting its location across half the ocean. The Romeo sonar operator would have heard it all: the rush of water, the metallic groans, the cavitation trail like a beacon. Even worse for the sub, every U.S. ship in the nearby carrier strike group heard it too. What should have been a covert patrol had turned into an unforced error, one that erased hours of careful maneuvering. Back in the air, the Romeo's crew didn't need to say much. They knew they'd won the psychological game. The submarine had panicked itself into the open, while the Z-10 overhead was still thrashing around like a guard dog barking at shadows. One wrong move from Beijing's pilot had endangered not just his mission, but the very asset he was sent to protect. The irony was brutal. In trying to save the submarine, the Z-10 had doomed it in any real combat scenario. The US didn't have to fire a single shot. The Chinese had sabotaged themselves. And yet, the humiliation wasn't over. Because just as the sub disappeared into the depths, the Z-10 pilot believed he'd finally gained the upper hand. 18 minutes into the encounter, the Z-10 pilot finally thought he'd scored a victory. His fire control radar gave off the familiar warbling tone. The Romeo was locked. To a Chinese audience back home, this would have looked like dominance. Their helicopter staring down at an American war machine. For a split second, the pilot felt he'd turned the tables. But confidence in combat can be a trap. The Romeo's crew knew the lock wasn't lethal. The Z-10 wasn't armed with long-range air-to-air missiles capable of bringing them down. What it had were short-range rockets and guns, weapons designed for ground attack, not duels with high-tech naval helicopters. Getting painted by that radar meant nothing. Nothing more than valuable emissions pouring into the Romeo's databanks again. Every frequency, every pulse width, every tiny adjustment the pilot made was logged and transmitted. The wrong helicopter had been chosen for this standoff. A Romeo isn't just a target. It's an intelligence sponge. The American crew barely reacted. No sharp maneuvering, no panic over the radar lock. They stayed steady, calm, almost bored, because they knew something Beijing didn't. Their helicopter was less vulnerable to this particular threat than the submarine below had been. Meanwhile, the submarine commander's frustration was boiling. He'd hoped the Z-10 would draw the Americans away. But instead, the Romeo highlighted his position even more. The sub's emergency dive had already given the carrier strike group enough acoustic data to track it for days, and now the helicopter overhead was siphoning away electronic fingerprints that could expose China's air tactics for years. For the U.S. Navy, this was the jackpot. They hadn't just forced a submarine into the open, but they'd also captured detailed recordings of China's newest attack helicopter in action. Beijing had staged a show of force, but what it delivered was an open book of secrets. The Z-10 pilot had no idea. Convinced his radar lock meant control, he pressed harder, banking close and firing more flares in a final attempt to intimidate. To him, it was victory. To the Americans, it was the sound of China giving away everything for free. And as the minutes ticked by, the lesson became clear. Sometimes the greatest weakness isn't the weapon you lack, but it's the arrogance of believing you're holding the stronger hand. When the Z-10 finally peeled off and returned to base, the Romeo crew didn't celebrate, they just logged another entry in a long list of encounters. For them, this wasn't about bragging rights. This was about information. Every radar sweep, every communication burst, every frantic move from the submarine below had been captured, stored, and sent back to analysts who would turn the chaos into intelligence gold. For Beijing, though, the outcome was sobering. Instead of demonstrating control over the South China Sea, they had revealed vulnerabilities. Their prized Z-10 had been exposed as more showpiece than threat. Worse, the Type 039 submarine had panicked under pressure, proving just how fragile diesel-electric stealth can be against disciplined anti-submarine warfare tactics. The Americans hadn't fired a missile, launched a fighter, or even changed their flight plan. By staying calm and focused, they forced their opponent into a cascade of mistakes. It was a reminder of an old naval truth. The side that keeps its cool usually wins. For U.S. planners, the lesson was crystal clear. China's intimidation tactics could be flipped into opportunities. What Beijing intended as a warning became a gift, one that revealed more about Chinese doctrine than any spy satellite ever could. The Romeo crew had played their role perfectly, turning noise into knowledge. And that raises a question for every viewer. If one helicopter could flip the script so easily, what happens the next time Beijing tries the same trick against an entire carrier strike group? So here's the real question for you. If you were sitting in that Romeo watching the Z-10 throw flares and bark over the radio, would you have laughed it off or gotten a little nervous? Drop your take in the comments. I want to see where you stand. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this breakdown. And hey, If you want to go a step further and support the channel directly, join the fleet. You get loyalty badges, priority responses, and you help us bring more true maritime stories to the surface. Just click join on our channel page and get on board. And remember, the next time you try to scare off the US Navy, make sure you're not handing them your entire playbook for free. I'll see you in the next one.